Imagine yourself communicating with a difference. Pan-Dimensional Solutions helps you do this. Whether live spectator events, taped broadcasts, or real-time audience-engaging programs, you can benefit immediately from the tools Pan-Dimensional Solutions will share with you. Do you want to make a difference? Contact us at pandimensional.com. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hey, everybody. We're starting it all over again because it was so good, but we don't have to do that because
Join us each episode
you're here with us live, and we're here doing everything we can to provide you the kind of exciting news in the Greater Western New York region that we could provide. Every once in a while, there's a little slip up there just to make sure that you know that we're going live. So we'd like to thank you for having us with you today. And the person that we'd like to thank most, however, is Assemblyman Joseph Giglio, who represents the 148th Assembly District in New York State. He's with us live from his Olean office right now. Assemblyman Giglio, how are we doing today in Olean? How's the weather?
Well, it's quite dreary today, actually, Chris. It's cloudy and rainy.
Cloudy and rainy. Yeah, I think it's pretty much that way all across the board here. So let us, we just finished the budget process in Albany. Can you tell us a little bit how it went? You know, what were some of the things that you didn't expect to happen? Maybe some of the things that did happen, and just give us an overview of the budget itself.
Well, the first thing I talk about when it comes to the budget is the process. The budget was late this year. It didn't have to be. The negotiations went on and on. By the time we, as Assembly people, finally got to see, or the whole legislature finally got to see the budget, we didn't really have time to dissect it because everything was passed, which was called the message of necessity. And that's kind of ridiculous since we knew the budget is due the same time every year, and the federal money had been already declared and how much. So it didn't really make a lot of sense for us to be late this year. That was the first. That's the first thing that really jumps out at you. It's just irresponsible that this keeps happening, and that we didn't have a chance to have this budget vetted in the proper way of 3 days of the bills to age, and that the stakeholders and the legislators have a chance to review it. Instead, we usually got it hot off the presses and had to make quick decisions without getting input from the public or any of the other stakeholders. That was very disappointing. The other part of the budget that's disappointing is it's $212 billion. With the federal money that was sent to us, there was actually no need for an increase. That was forced through by downstate folks with the governor's approval. And it just doesn't make sense because somewhere down the line, as they kick the can down the road, someone's going to pay for that. And it'll be our children and our grandchildren that'll be forced to pay for it. So irresponsible budgeting that led up to this budget caused a lot of problems. The federal government helped, but again, that's still your money. And those were the things that were most troubling about it.
Well, let's talk.
There were good things in it for education.
Okay, I was going to say, before we move into some of the specifics, let's talk about some general aspects of the budget that you mentioned, and that is that you had 3 days to look at it. Hasn't it been this way for a long time, that really the budget is hammered out within a small group of people before it's sent out to everybody else? And why does it keep happening that way?
Well, it happens that way because of the rules of the legislature and the rules that the governor promulgates and the way it works. Those three people make decisions for everyone, and then we are presented with their final decisions. It doesn't have to be that way. That's the way they choose to have it. And so that's why you don't get input from rank and file legislators.
I see. So we don't need that under my name. So the idea of this budget coming through, you really don't have a time to review it. You mentioned that there was
increases in revenues, how did those increases come about? Were they taxes? Were there other means to increase revenues? What sort of impact are we going to see here within the greater Western New York region?
Well, I think you won't see the impact so much this year because the revenues generated were directed towards the super rich. And the problem with that becomes 1% of those super rich pay almost 40% of the taxes. And if they decide to leave the state of New York, then you start running low on money. So that could be one of the possible negative effects. If these people choose to leave, you start down the line again, as you kick the can, it'll cause you problems with revenue. The next budgets, without this kind of revenue in it, will be the problems. Now, we've got $12 billion from the federal government right to New York State. New York City got $6 billion. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority got another $6 billion. And then the final $9 billion went to education. That was all money from the feds. That still would have raised our budget past what it had been in the previous year. So there was no need for it to go that much higher. It was some of the things they chose to do and get those taxes raised up, which means that at $212 billion, we're more than Texas and Florida combined, and both states are larger than us.
Where did all that extra revenue go to? What are they using it for? Not the federal government, but the money that they used what raised within the budget.
Right, part of that money went to education, obviously. Some of it went to the good parts, is that aid to localities was restored, which had not been there. The infrastructure CHIPS monies were put back in for the highways, things that are most important to us. The highways were taken care of. There was more winter recovery money for that. And like I said, the help to the local governments that suffered greatly from the COVID-19 pandemic, they were going to get new monies available to them that would restore some of the losses that they had before. So we hopefully will make all those governments whole and move forward from there. But that's their tax structure. We're filling their holes. That's what the federal money was meant to do, to help for the recovery from COVID. And part of New York's problem is we already had a huge spending problem and a hole in our budget before COVID hit. And actually, COVID was hitting when we passed our last budget, and we knew at that point that it should have been an austerity budget because we didn't know what to expect. We got the worst of it, and so the feds in this case helped bail us out with $12 billion strictly to the state of New York. But when you add in the $6 billion to the New York City area, and then another $6 billion to the MTA, you see that money was directed strictly down, pretty much downstate. That's $12 million for downstate alone. $12 million, not counting $12 billion that was shared among the rest of the state, including New York City, and that $9 billion overall for education. Those are numbers that are incredible, Chris. Absolutely incredible. They should have been more than enough to solve any holes in our budget without having to raise taxes, which again, sounds good when they talk about it, but when those things hit and that revenue changes, we're going to have a big problem.
So when you mentioned austere budget for last year, if we were going to go into an austere budget, what would be some of the areas that might be cut?
Well, I don't think we nearly had to cut them. I think we just had to keep things level and give them the 2% increase that they needed. We asked everybody else in the state of New York to live within a tax cap of 2%. We should have done the same thing. Instead, I think we raised spending at a rate we shouldn't have, and we added policy to the budget, last year's budget, which we always argue against because a budget should be a fiscal document that would then initially raise cost of local governments and education.
One of the questions that I keep hearing from the mayors and supervisors when I interview them on another show that I host is that the state holds back on sales tax money and then decides whether or not to give it back. And the mayors and supervisors said in the past that this money was always going directly to their own municipalities. It didn't have to go through the state, and I think it might have been Ames or CHIP. I can't remember what the acronym was.
Yeah, you're talking about their sales tax. You're right, and that was one of the governor's ways of trying to keep revenue in his hands so he could distribute it. when he felt like it. Too much power. He grabbed all the power he could during the COVID crisis, and then he became the arbiter of what money was going, and then he held it back. And he kept telling everybody he was going to hold it back at 20%, the rest of their revenues at 20% that were supposed to go to them from that budget. And so they were budgeting as if they had already lost the 20%, when in reality they never did. Because again, there was money available, and the revenue projections turned out that he was crying wolf, but Wall Street was humming, and a lot of money, which Wall Street represents a good portion, about 20% of the New York State budget. That money, Wall Street performed better than anybody thought, so that there was not a shortfall there.
Right. I would just want to remind our viewers that if you're watching this live via Zoom, then feel free to ask us a question, and I will direct it over to the Assemblyman. Anything that you want that you think might be relevant to our discussion, or even if you know something about what Assemblyman Giglio likes or is interested in, feel free to ask the question, and I can just pick over the screen and look at it. Assemblyman, I know that one of the areas that you're most familiar with is in the correction facilities there. What did the budget do to that, and what kind of impact does it have on the greater Western New York region?
Well, the correction facility thing is something that the governor has done consistently as he tries to dismantle the correction system. He has ignored a 2005 law that says you have to give 1 year's notice before you close the facility. So what he does is they put it in the budget, giving him unilateral control over how many facilities he's going to close, and he does it. The last three were in a 90-day window. Before that, it was a 60-day window. That's circumventing the law again. The law was made to right-size correctional facilities, and it gave them. That's why it had That's how it had a closure notice of 1 year, to give those folks that work in those facilities a chance to prepare to change where they're going to be working, and have their families uprooted and changed immediately without much notice. This year it came 4 days before Christmas, and those facilities were closed before March 31st in less than 90 days. That's not fair to the people that actually work in these facilities. And it's not just COs, it's nurses, it's counselors, it's teachers, and you're taking apart a whole part of the community without any other input. And he should not have that unilaterally. He should be following the 2005 rules. Secondly, he's supposed to have an adaptive reuse plan. Again, that has not been presented to us either. And you don't come up with one in 90 days. If you can come up with one in a year, that'd be great. And that way it protects those communities from losing everything they have, because most of these closures are in rural communities where that is one of the main employers. So once you take them out of the economic equation, that changes everything too. That changes the gas stations, the supermarkets, the restaurants, all those things that depend on those employees that live in those communities. And again, we choose to live in these rural communities. That's all changed with 90 days notice, 4 days before Christmas this year. And this year he had asked in the budget for 2 years, which we fought vehemently. They gave him one, and we're still against that, unless he goes back to the why would you circumvent a law? And why do you think that's okay? It is not okay. That's why that law was passed. And he is not, he has become the sole arbiter of that too, which means more government in a general sense, Chris, is being moved to Albany and taken away from the locals. And local government knows best, but not in this governor's case.
Well, speaking of local government, and we had a question about the impact on the new cannabis legislation, which you mentioned about using the budget as a way to institute policy. This seems like it might be an example of that. I know, again, from talking with mayors and supervisors, they're kind of challenged by whether or not to opt in and opt out. We have about a minute before the first break, so if you can just kind of give us a sense for, what was the discussion like about this, and what does this opt-in, opt-out mean for these mayors and supervisors?
Okay, the cannabis law was passed outside of the budget on March 30th, which was a good thing that we got to debate that by itself. But the thing is, local governments and cities and towns and villages must act within 9 months of the enactment to opt out, allowing these businesses to open. No local law, um, may be adopted after December 31st. Local governments may, at a later date, pass a local law to opt back in to permit such establishments to open. That's the exact language that's in the bill, and it's somewhat confusing.
Okay, well, we'll take a break right now, folks. Be sure to come back when we talk to Assemblyman Giglio about some interesting things about Western New York that you may or may not know about. We'll see you in a moment. Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. "50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard." Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com. Welcome back to the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm your host, Chris Carosa, and with me today is Assemblyman Joseph Giglio. He's right now in Olean, and we actually have a question from Mark about something. It's a little off topic, but I don't even know if you know this answer. But he says, I have a hunting camp outside of Olean in Hinsdale, and I'm wondering if crossbow hunting season will be expanded to mirror the regular bow hunting season. I guess this is a state issue. I'm not sure.
It is a state issue that we've been advocating for a while. I don't think that it's been passed yet, but I can double check on that. And you can call my office anytime for that answer.
Very good. Thank you. Again, if you have a question, feel free to just type them in on Zoom if you're watching live. If you're watching the replay, you can always come back to us and get the invitation to the Zoom meeting. Just join us. Register at stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com, which if I were smart, I would actually have that up there. Oh, I do. Look at that. There we go. If you want to ask questions and join us for the weekly live show every Thursday at noon, just register at stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com and we'll send you the invite. It's free and you can do whatever you want. Okay, so let's talk about some more interesting things. I understand that you have an interest in history. Give us a little background on that.
Actually, since college, I majored in criminal justice, but I took so much history that they invited me into the Honor Society, which nobody ever believes me when I tell them that, but it did happen. And I've always had a great interest in history. When I got this job, I delved into it a lot closer than I had before. Strictly government, being that government part of history, and I read up, on books on George Washington, Team of Rivals by Doris Goodwin, for obviously Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt's books. I've read those too, and tried to understand how we got to where we are now, what our founding fathers would have thought of today's government, the way it functions, and looking at state government and the way it had worked up until now was important to me. So I thought to me you needed to know the history on how we got to this point so that you could move forward. And so I did a lot of that kind of reading. And obviously, you read about George Washington and what he went through, 4 years away from his family as he helped to fight a war, and that his wife actually came, to Valley Forge for a while to be with them, and how the soldiers, were all volunteers and for the most part. And you read about the trials of Abraham Lincoln and saw what he went through to keep the Union together. And then you move to somebody like Theodore Roosevelt, who was went after big business and things like that, and nature, the things he did for nature, um, has been amazing to me. So you look at all those and you keep moving forward. In history, history is always, foreshadows what's going to happen next, and you're supposed to learn from it, so you're not
Right.
doomed to repeat it.
So those are certainly icons on a national level. What about in terms of local history? What have you delved into with that?
Well, I've looked at Theodore Roosevelt was partly because he was both an assemblyman and a governor before he moved on, and Franklin Roosevelt was also, I believe, a senator. And you look back at how those things worked, and you go back into even the near past, and you look at how Mario Cuomo ran his government, how George Pataki ran the governor's office, and then Spitzer Patterson to the current governor. And I happened to, when I first got this job, I happened to serve with both Pataki for 1 year, Spitzer for just over a year, and then Patterson and Cuomo. So I had served with 4 governors in less than 5 years. And so you had to understand where they were all coming from and what they thought history looked like. And one of the things we were talking about, the budget issue of putting policy in a budget, was really started by David Patterson. And this governor took it to new heights. Patterson used it when he was when he was trying to solve a deficit, back when he took over for Spitzer. So those are the kind of historical facts you got to look forward. Then you have a governor now who used that kind of pressure to put policy in the budget, and then if you don't pass the budget by the deadline, he could bring that whole policy forward in an extender. And that's what happened. And people don't know that historically about what happened in New York budgets, how 3 men in a room or 3 people in a room now evolved, and how much power is given to the Speaker of the Assembly and the Majority Leader of the Senate. If people knew that's the way this government worked, they would be sick. It's not the way our forefathers wanted this government to work. It's not full participants anymore. It's everything's concentrated in one place.
We had earlier this year, we had Steuben Hawley and David DiPietro on. Each of them are offering bills that have to do with giving us regional autonomy, or giving all the regions in the state more autonomy. Have you looked at those bills at all, or have you heard about what people are talking about them?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Though both of them are close colleagues of mine, and we've always discussed the two-state type thing, and David's autonomous regions thing. But there's not an easy way to get there. Okay, Steve's bill, Mr. Hawley's bill, has it so that all he's asking for is a referendum to see if people want more than one state. David's is autonomous regions, which is a little bit different. The problem is very simple, that the state of New York, as it sits and the way it's been created, was created way back. Again, Western New York is not part of the initial New York colony. Okay, we were actually fought over between Massachusetts and New York won. And then the canal was built, and that canal that was built, again, looking at history, that canal that was built from what is now Western New York to Albany down to New York City is what helped make New York City the greatest port in the world, because the goods came from us in the Midwest down to them because of the canal. So all those things, again, looking at history, Chris, that's how New York got to be the size, or the size it was. And you can see right now it doesn't work. And that's why we have these bills. It doesn't work because what New York City is Eastern Seaboard. Us in Western New York are more Midwest. Our economy is more Midwest based. We are producers. We make things. We grow things. That's why we are who we are. They have a complete, at this point in history, going back to when, no governor from quote unquote upstate, which I hate when they call us that, by the way, has been from Western New York or upstate since God knows when. The last one might have been Frank Whalen Jennings Higgins from Olean, New York, and he succeeded Theodore Roosevelt, and it was for 2 years back then. So there's a disconnect here, a huge disconnect here, and that's why those budget bills come up. But then there's the federal government. Last time any state split was West Virginia and Virginia, and that only happened because of the Civil War. So going again back into history, Chris, you can see it's an enormous jump. And the last time two states were admitted to the Union, and it always is two states, was Alaska and Hawaii. And that was because they were scared that the Senate would be controlled by one party or the other. But they couldn't have been more wrong, because they thought Alaska was going to be Democrat and Hawaii was going to be Republican, and the exact opposite happened. So their foresight wasn't all that great either.
Well, is there any reason to talk more about this state thing, given the fact that you hear things about Washington, D.C. becoming a state, Puerto Rico becoming a state, California wanting to split up into states? I think there's Colorado and maybe a couple other states are talking about splitting. I mean, if everyone else is doing it, why shouldn't? Or are we going to be behind the ball on things if we don't start talking about it?
Well, I think you're right. And California has gone the farthest. In fact, 2 years ago, they had a referendum that was taken out of the off the state ballot that year because of technical issues. They want to split into 3 states, and you can see why, because of their population. In our case, I think we could split into 3 states easy, with Long Island, New York City, and the rest of the rest of the state forming their own states. And then you could add Washington, D.C. or Puerto Rico, and you'd still have the same even number of senators. And then you could guess what parties those senators would be from if that were the case. But again, you need congressional approval. And it's, for some reason, states seem to be sacred. And that although it doesn't work, there's no way to change it. And there is a belief out of New York City that we could not survive on our own, which is a joke, because we would excel, given the chance to use our own resources the way we wanted to, and to have our tax structure the way we want it, to have government autonomous and local governments in more control than a central government out of Albany. There's a lot of good things, and you can look at the elections, look at the way the gubernatorial elections go. Our part of the state does not vote for the person that has been elected governor. He gets isolated parts. He gets all the urban parts. Well, I'm not urban. I represent one of the most rural counties in the state of New York. Like I said, Cattaraugus, Allegany, and part of Steuben, 2,500 square miles. My brethren in New York, my colleagues, some of them represent 4 square blocks. I know that might be an exaggeration, but 2,500 square miles is much different than an assembly district in the city of New York that represents, again, a smaller amount of people than I do. I represent the max 134,000 for an assembly district. Look at New York. There's no district there that I believe has 134. They're more like 124. So they could move the power downstate and keep isolating us.
By rounding down in New York City, does that give them an advantage? Do they have more assemblymen because of that?
Right. They are. Yeah, exactly. The former speaker made that part of what he did. Why would we, where we have the least amount of population city, be forced to have 134,000 people in it? And then a New York City district where if you added blocks, you could get to the 134, instead of you keep them at the 124. You keep them at the bottom and you move us to the top. We've got geography here. We have distance, but we do not have population density.
Yeah. Well, we have just about a minute left, and can we leave with some hope? What can people do? What can regular people do as far as addressing this issue, whether it's autonomy or, joining the line about being a state? Is there something to get the conversation moving forward? Because I get the impression when talking to you and others that, we talk about it once and then we drop it. It doesn't sound like it's really moving forward.
Well, again, the problem is that most people don't capable of doing this. It's a long process. But if they stick to it and they do petitions or they write to their local assembly people and senators and keep that thought going, at some point, as you said, there's so many different issues within this country and so many different states that are having problems with the way this was way back after colonial time, post-revolutionary times. It causes us to modernize. And in this state particularly, the way it's shaped and the way it works, we need to modernize. We're more Midwest, like I said, than Eastern Seaboard. and we're
All right,
governed by the Eastern Seaboard.
Well, thank you very much, Assemblyman Giglio. And as always, thank you for being on the show. And if anybody wants to contact him, you just go to his office. If you'd like to learn more about our show, just go to State of Greater Western New York, state.of.greaterwesternnewyork.com. Register for there. We'll keep you on our mailing list. We'll tell you when the next show is and how to Zoom in with us to ask live questions. Other than that, this is Chris Carosa saying thank you, and we'll see you next week.